Welcome everybody, it's Taormino here, and today's a great day because today's Monday, start of a work week for some of you guys, but it is the start of a new game series that I want to have here on YouTube. This isn't going to be a review or a top 10 or anything like that. It's simply going to be my memories behind some of the games and some of the most influential games in my life that I've played that really got me hooked into video games. Some of them are just games that I don't like, that I have memories of, and I will discuss. But for the very first episode, I wanted to talk about my most favorite video game of all time. There have been a lot of contenders, but this is certainly my most favorite game of all time, and it is Final Fantasy III for the Super Nintendo. Now, before I get into my memory, so people don't get confused, Final Fantasy III was on the Super Nintendo. It was the third Final Fantasy game to be released within the United States. But in reality, it was actually Final Fantasy VI in Japan. So on the Super Nintendo, it was Final Fantasy III, but on all other platforms, after it was corrected, it eventually was Final Fantasy VI. So there is another Final Fantasy III out in the world, but it wasn't on Super Nintendo. So, I remember when I was a child, I wasn't that young. This came out in 94? I used to go to a babysitter's before school. So my babysitter was not in the city. I didn't go to school in the city that I lived in. It was like the adjacent city. So we would go to this babysitter a couple hours in the morning. Then a group of us would walk to school. It was like a couple blocks to go to school, back when we were allowed to walk to school. And then we would go to school, we'd come back, hang out for a couple hours, my parents would come pick me and my brother up, we'd go home. On the summers, though, they would still drop us off, because their jobs wouldn't end in the summertime. Our school did. So we would hang out at the daycare. I would call it a daycare. It was a babysitter. It was nothing special. It was a garage. It had very, very thin carpeting, not much lighting, and no protection from the elements, really. So a lot of the times in the summer, we sat in this dark garage with the lights out, so it would stay cooler in the summertime. This was California, so it wasn't super crazy hot. But I will keep this gentleman's last name out of this because it's irrelevant. But there was a kid and his brother that ended up coming to our babysitters. His name was Ryan. And Ryan's parents were well off. If I can recall, they were both lawyers. That may be wrong, but if I remember correctly, they were just well off. So in the summertime, Ryan would bring Sega Genesis systems. He would bring Sega CD. He'd bring Super Nintendo, NES. He brought a Jaguar once. That was the one and only time I've ever experienced a Jaguar in my life, playing that console. But one time he brought his Super Nintendo, and he brought Final Fantasy III. And when I was younger, I played through this game. Well, as I was playing the game, I didn't pay attention to the story too much. I can just remember how amazing everything looked. Now, keep in mind, this is when the Super Nintendo and the Sega were either current gen, or there was no higher Nintendo system at the time. Super Nintendo was Nintendo's highest system. And I remember looking at it, it was very, very colorful, and the sprite work was just, in my opinion, spot on. It looked great. Everything of this game was completely beautiful in its artwork, except for the minecart scene that was pixel hell, in my opinion. But everything other than that scene was great. And I remember playing this game, there were so many characters to choose from. There's a total of 14 characters, and you have a party of 4 in the game, instead of 3 like in more recent Final Fantasy games. You would have a party of 4, and the game would do a good job of constantly swapping out party members for sake of mainline storytelling. So much so that I didn't know, around my first time playing it, who the main character was. Partly because I wasn't paying attention to the story, but I just found that each one of these characters were unique in their own right, had their own motivations for battling the bad guys, and they had their own special techniques. Each one of them were different from one another. So it really was, what was your preference in battle? You had people who had techniques where you would punch in combinations on the controller. You had people who were like red mages. You had black mages. You had people who would do mimic techniques. You would just have somebody who was constantly in berserk mode. There was all kinds of stuff. And I remember playing it and not finishing it. And I remember begging Ryan one time, because he was actually not going to be showing up the following day, but I was going to be showing up to the following day at the babysitter's, but he wasn't going to be coming. I begged him, and thank goodness he decided to leave his Super Nintendo with Final Fantasy 3 there for me to play. In my household, we were a gaming household even back then, but we went from the NES to the Sega Genesis. We skipped over the Super Nintendo, so I never owned a Super Nintendo growing up. My best friend had one. We would go over there and play a lot of games. But this was my opportunity to really just delve deep into this game. Now, I never really beat it as a child. I just remember playing the heck out of it and just enjoying every moment. And a few years later, I remember, throughout the years rather, I always recalled hearing in the back of my mind the soundtrack of this game. Just constantly just hearing it and just remembering how awesome the music was. How awesome the music was for each character, to show emotion in a scene, to talk about like the opera scene, or to make you understand suicide. There's a suicide like part of the story. You know, they certainly covered a lot of themes in this game that didn't fully register with me when I was younger. So eventually, I saved up all my money that I could when I was younger, and I remember calling Funkoland when they still existed. And I was like, Funkoland, do you have a Super Nintendo in Final Fantasy 3? And they're like, well, yes, we got both. How much are they? And I remember writing down on a piece of paper, like to a T, with how much to a penny, like how much the Super Nintendo is. Super Nintendo, and I'd write out the thing. Final Fantasy 3, I'd write out the amount. And stuff like that. And finally, once I saved enough money, I finally pestered my father enough to take me to Funkoland and pick it up. And I remember walking in the store. The store seemed a little barren, but they had like a Super Nintendo in a glass case. And I remember walking up to the counter and I'm like, one Super Nintendo and Final Fantasy 3, please. Like, like the little kid me. And I remember walking out of that store so freaking happy that I got that. And this game was so incredible that I've played it so many times after that. Like, once I finally took it home, I played it through, I paid attention to the story. You know, I did as much as I can side quest wise, and I still loved it. I loved everything about it. Just like I showed you a minute ago, back in 2007, I missed it so much that I wanted to buy the soundtrack. And this is made in Japan. I don't know if you can see this, but I had to have it. And I've owned this game on every platform that I could ever since. I always prayed when I was younger, because I grew up playing Game Boys and handhelds, that I could finally get this game and play it on the go. And then lo and behold, we got it on the Game Boy Advance. It was so awesome, so I had that. I actually just got this from Retro Game Treasure, where it's got Final Fantasy V and Final Fantasy VI inside, and it's still sealed, which is cool. So I finally have that on the PlayStation 1, because that was actually something that I never actually owned. I have it on my PlayStation 3 store. I actually have it on my phone as a mobile game. Let's see if it shows up. In its beautiful glory. You know, this is just something that I'm never going to forget. And it was just something that just captured my heart and kept me interested. And maybe because I paced it out, I don't know, maybe it was the subject of the story. In my opinion, it was everything about this game that hooked me, from the graphics to the music to the unique characters, to how many unique characters there were, to the amount of side quests and backstory to each characters. It just, to see, and this isn't going to be any spoilers because I am currently streaming the game on our Retro Wednesdays for Kinda Okay Gamers. This game has a bad guy who finally succeeds in what he wants to do, and we'll just leave it there. It's something that I never really experienced in a video game, especially up to that point in my gaming life. So this game was beyond incredible. And while there are some good close contenders to my favorite Final Fantasy game of all time, this certainly takes the cake. And I would say if you've never played this game before, you should certainly play it. There's nothing about this game, in my opinion, that you would dislike about it. Everything is great. I'm giving a lot of hype right now, but it's just something that I have not only nostalgia glasses for, but I feel like it is an all-around great game. So please let me know in the comments section below, if you've played Final Fantasy III, what's your opinions on Final Fantasy III for the Super Nintendo? Do you look forward to possibly playing Final Fantasy III? Do you like it? Do you dislike it? Let me know in the conversation. I'd love to have a discussion with you guys about this. But I appreciate you guys all for watching, and tune in for the next Memory Monday.